The winter Florence Callahan buried her husband. The ground was so frozen it took her and her eldest son 3 full days to dig the grave deep enough, and she did not shed a single tear until the last shovel of earth had been tamped down flat. That was the first winter. She had 4 more to survive after it. Thomas Callahan had been a good man in the way that many good men of the Kansas frontier were good, steadfast, quiet, capable with his hands, and then suddenly, terribly gone. A fever had taken him in December of 1873, the kind that arrived without warning and left no room for argument. He had been 34 years old. Florence had been 31. Their sons, Eli and Samuel, had been 9 and 6 respectively, and they had stood beside their mother at the frozen mound of earth with their hats pressed against their chests, and their eyes wide with the particular bewilderment of children who do not yet fully understand that the word forever means exactly what it sounds like. The homestead sat 14 miles outside of Harrow Creek, a modest town that had grown up around a railway stop in central Kansas. The land itself was 240 acres of mostly stubborn clay soil, interrupted by a creek that ran reliably in spring and summer, and turned to a grudging trickle by October. Thomas had built the cabin himself with timber hauled from 30 miles away, and the structure was solid enough, if small, one main room with a hearth, a loft where the boys slept, and a lean-to kitchen that Florence had always privately believed would separate from the main building in a strong enough wind. It never did, though the wind certainly tried. She had a mule named Hector, 3 laying hens that she refused to slaughter no matter how desperate the circumstances, a milk cow named Beatrice who was aging but dependable, and approximately $16 in coin that Thomas had set aside in a tin beneath the floorboards. She stretched those $16 through the remainder of that first winter by trading eggs in town, mending clothes for the wives of merchants, and accepting precisely one single meal from a neighbor, old Marta Svensson from the farm 3 miles east, before deciding firmly and finally that she would not accept charity from anyone. Not because she was proud in the mean, foolish way, but because the moment she began accepting things she had not earned, she was not certain she could stop, and if she could not stop, she was not certain she could keep believing that the situation was temporary. Keeping that belief was the most important work she did. The second winter was worse than the first because it brought a blizzard in early November that killed her potato crop entirely and lamed Hector for 6 weeks. She took in washing from the saloon in Harrow Creek, hauling the bundles back and forth on a sled she built from planks and rope, and she taught Eli, who was 10 by then, to set snares in the creek brush for rabbits. He was good at it. He had Thomas's patience, that boy. He could sit still in the cold for an hour without complaint, watching the snare with those steady dark eyes, and when he came home with 2 rabbits tied at the hip and his cheeks gone red as apples, Florence would fry them in the iron skillet and pretend she was not faint with relief. Samuel was softer than his brother, more inclined toward tears and toward questions that did not have satisfying answers. Why did Papa die? He asked once, sitting at the table with his hands folded, and Florence had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Because sometimes the body simply cannot fight hard enough, and there is no fault in that." Samuel had thought about this and then asked if she was going to die too, and she had said, "Not for a very long time, and I intend to make myself far too stubborn for any fever to take seriously." He had laughed at that, a small, uncertain laugh, but it was laughter, and she counted every laugh from those years as a victory. By the third winter, Florence had taken on a small kitchen garden that she expanded each spring, adding more rows each year until she had enough tomatoes and beans, and corn put up in the cellar to carry them reliably through the cold months. She had also, quietly and with considerable difficulty, taught herself to handle Thomas's rifle. Not well, not with any particular grace or confidence, but adequately. She could bring down a deer at reasonable range, and she did so twice in the third winter and twice in the fourth, and the venison carried enormous weight in those months. She did not ask anyone for anything. This was a fact known and quietly admired throughout the county, though admiration from a distance is a particular and limited comfort. The women in town would sometimes discuss Florence Callahan in the way that people discuss things they find both impressive and slightly uncomfortable, praising her fortitude with one breath, and suggesting with the next that she really ought to consider taking a boarder, or accepting the pastor's offer of a woodpile, or allowing the Ladies' Aid Society to bring a Christmas basket. Florence always declined. She was never unkind about it. She would smile and say she was managing perfectly well, and then she would go home and manage perfectly well, because she had made a decision and she intended to honor it. The fifth winter was almost her undoing. It began with Beatrice dying in October. The cow simply lay down in the barn one evening and did not get up again, and Florence spent 2 hours sitting beside her in the straw before accepting that it was over. Without the milk, without the butter she sold to supplement their income, the economics of the winter became genuinely frightening. She sold the hide and what meat could be used, which gave her a little. She cut firewood herself that autumn until her palms bled through the calluses, and she stacked it higher than she ever had before, and she replaced the chinking on the north wall of the cabin with clay mixed with dry grass, and she resolved with every ounce of her considerable will that they were going to be fine. Then Eli, who was now 14 and doing the work of a grown man, fell through the ice on the creek in late November trying to retrieve a stuck snare. He dragged himself out and walked home half frozen, and he was sick for 3 weeks afterward. Not fatally sick, not the terrifying kind of sick, but the grinding, exhausting kind that kept him in his bedroll and unable to do the outdoor work that Florence absolutely needed done. She sat with him at night and kept cool compresses on his forehead and read to him from the one novel they owned, a battered copy of a Dickens story with the cover torn off. And during the days, she did his work and her own work, and came inside each evening with her joints aching in a way that made her feel considerably older than 36. It was during this particular week, the last week of November in 1878, that Noah Bailey arrived in Harrow Creek. He came in on horseback with a bedroll tied behind his saddle and a Winchester rifle in the scabbard, which in that era and that part of Kansas was not remarkable in any way. What was slightly remarkable was that he stopped his horse in the middle of the main street and sat there for a moment looking at the town with an expression of genuine assessment, not the usual wary or weary expression of a man passing through, but the particular look of a man calculating whether a place might be worth staying in. He was 33 years old, tall in the saddle, with the sun-darkened complexion and work-worn hands of a man who had spent his years outdoors. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that people sometimes noticed and then found difficult to describe afterward. He had a dark beard kept short and a coat that had been good quality once and was still decent. He took a room at the Harrow Creek Hotel, which was a generous name for 2 floors above a hardware store, and he ate dinner at the establishment across the street that advertised itself as a restaurant, but was primarily a kitchen run by a widow named Mrs. Potts who could produce a creditable beef stew and not much else. He asked the hotel keeper, a man named Aldous Finch, whether there was work available in the area, and Aldous told him that the mercer spread about 8 miles out was looking for a winter hand, and that there was occasional work at the grain mill on the creek road, and that a man with skills could generally find something in a town that was still growing. Noah said he was handy with carpentry and knew horses and cattle, and Aldous said that would likely serve him well, and that was more or less the entirety of their conversation. What brought him to Harrow Creek specifically was a thing he would not explain to Aldous Finch or to anyone else in the immediate term. He had spent the previous 8 years working his way through Texas and up through the territory, following cattle and construction work, and occasionally serving as a deputy in small towns that needed one, and the accumulated weight of all of that movement had reached a point where he needed to stop somewhere and see if stopping suited him. He had a little money. He had no particular entanglements. He had arrived at 33 with the quiet sense that a man could keep moving indefinitely and find himself at the end, having covered considerable ground, but arrived nowhere meaningful. He went to the Mercer spread the following morning and spoke with Walt Mercer, who was a decent man running a cattle operation that had survived the difficult years better than most. Walt offered him board in the bunkhouse and a monthly wage, and Noah accepted, and that was how he began to learn the shape of the county and the names and natures of the people in it. He heard about Florence Callahan from Walt Mercer's wife, Clara, inside of his first week. Clara Mercer was the kind of woman who carried the social knowledge of the entire region in her head like a map, and she distributed relevant portions of it with good intentions and considerable accuracy. She mentioned Florence the way one mentions a point of pride or a puzzle. This woman out on the creek road, 2 boys, husband gone 5 years, never asked a soul for help. Clara said it with her head tilted slightly, and Noah found himself asking a question or two more than he'd intended, and Clara told him what she knew, which was quite a lot. He did not seek Florence out. That was not his nature. But the county was not large, and the roads were not many, and it was perhaps inevitable that he would encounter her. He saw her first at the grain mill in early December, and he did not know initially who she was. She was standing at the counter inside the mill, speaking to the miller in a tone that was measured and very calm. And the miller, a red-faced man named Gerhardt Bloom, was explaining that he could not extend any more credit. Florence was wearing a coat that had been mended at both elbows and relined at some point with what appeared to be feed sacking, and she had her hair pinned up under a hat that had known better days, and she was listening to Gerhardt Bloom explain about the credit with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Her spine was very straight. Her chin was level. She said thank you and turned and walked out, and Noah, who had come to collect a sack of grain for the Mercer horses, watched her go with a feeling he could not immediately name. Gerhardt Bloom, who was not a cruel man but was a businessman, shook his head and said, "That's Florence Callahan. Good woman. Hard situation," and then he took Noah's order. Noah paid for his grain and loaded it onto the wagon and drove back toward the Mercer spread, and he thought about the expression on Florence Callahan's face when she'd heard the word no. Not devastated, not angry, just very, very still in the way of someone who has heard difficult things before and has learned to absorb them without falling. He did not do anything about it immediately. He was not the kind of man who rushed at problems sideways and announced himself a solution. What he did instead was learn more. He talked to Walt Mercer, who confirmed what Clara had said and added that Florence's property was actually sound if she could get through the current winter. The soil was decent, and she had the creek for water, and the land was valued reasonably. Walt mentioned that her eldest boy had been sick, which had left her short-handed at a bad time of year. He said this without particular drama, and Noah listened without particular drama, and the conversation moved on to cattle and fencing. But 2 days later, Noah was driving the supply wagon into Harrow Creek for the Mercer household, and the road took him past the turnoff for the Callahan property, and he stopped the wagon and sat there for a full 30 seconds thinking about what Walt had said, and what Clara had said, and what he had seen at the mill, and then he made a decision that he understood was possibly presumptuous, but that he also felt fairly clearly was necessary. He turned down the creek road. The Callahan cabin came into view around a bend, set back from the creek with a stand of cottonwood trees on the north side that served as a windbreak. The cabin was small and clearly well tended. The yard was neat despite the snow. The woodpile was stacked with obvious care. The fence around the kitchen garden was maintained. There was smoke coming from the chimney and a pale winter light in the window, and as Noah pulled up, he could hear the sound of an axe. He followed the sound around the back of the cabin and found Florence Callahan splitting firewood in the gray December morning, and he stopped the wagon and got down. She saw him and stopped. She stood with the axe at her side and looked at him with the same level gaze he'd seen at the mill, and she waited. He took off his hat. He said, "My name is Noah Bailey. I am working out at the Mercer spread for the winter." He said, "I drove past your turnoff and I thought I might ask if there was anything that needed doing that an extra pair of hands could help with." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was thoughtful. She was measuring him with those eyes dark brown, steady as still water, and he stood in the cold and waited, holding his hat, and let her do it. She said, "What are you expecting in return?" He said, "Nothing. I have a full day and a wagon and I thought the offer was worth making." She looked at him for another moment. She said, "I appreciate the offer. I am managing fine." He said, "Yes, ma'am, I can see that." He looked at the woodpile and the neat yard and the smoke from the chimney, and he said it in a way that was genuine, not flattering. He meant it as an observation, not a compliment. And then he put his hat back on and said he was sorry to have interrupted her morning, and he went back to his wagon and he left. Florence stood in the cold for a moment after he drove away, and she was aware of something peculiar, which was that nobody in 5 years had driven up and asked what needed doing, and then simply accepted the answer and left without pressing the matter. The usual sequence involved at least 3 rounds of insistence before people gave up and went away slightly offended. This man had asked once, heard no, and gone. There was something about that she could not quite set down. She went back to splitting wood. Noah returned to the Mercer spread and said nothing to Walt or Clara about where he had been, and he went about his work, and he thought about Florence Callahan at intervals throughout the following days in the way one thinks about a thing that has lodged itself in the mind without permission. He went back a week later. He told himself it was because he genuinely had time, and the habit of useful occupation was ingrained deeply enough in him that idle hands made him restless. But he was honest enough with himself to know it was also because he wanted to see her again. He drove up the creek road with a small load of feed corn that he'd purchased in town with his own money, and he stopped at the gate. She came out of the cabin when she heard the wagon, and she stood on the step with her arms crossed and looked at him. He said, "I was in town and I came by feed corn." He held up the sack. He said, "I know you didn't ask for it, but I have more than I need and feed corn keeps poorly and it'd be a shame to waste it." She said, "That is a creative way to repackage charity." He said, "It isn't charity. Charity is giving somebody something they need because you pity them. I am not giving you this because I pity you. I am giving you this because I have it and you can use it, and because it seems to me that a woman who has run this place alone for 5 years has demonstrated more than enough that she does not need pity from anyone." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the creek and moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere inside the cabin a boy was coughing, and the sound was the particular sound of a chest that was still healing. She said, "Is that your eldest?" He said, "No, ma'am." "I'm not married." She said, "I meant the coughing. I was asking if that was your eldest boy." He felt the heat come to his face and was grateful for the cold air. He said, "I am sorry." "Yes, it is." He said, "His name is Eli. He was sick 3 weeks ago and he's still coming through it." She said, "Boil pine needles in water and have him breathe the steam. It helps the chest." He said, "I will tell you that, but I think you probably already know that." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the suggestion of one, like the first thin edge of dawn. She uncrossed her arms and came down off the step and took the feed corn from him, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Bailey." He said, "Noah." She said, "Thank you, Noah." And she went inside. He sat in the wagon for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he clicked to the horses and drove back down the road. After that, the visits became a regular thing, and neither of them discussed this directly. He would come every week or 10 days, always with something that could be plausibly explained. A sack of something from the mill, an extra tool he'd found at the Mercer place, information about a trading opportunity in town. He was always careful to bring things that could be construed as practical exchange rather than charity, because he had understood from that second visit that Florence Callahan's independence was not pride in the vain sense but something structural. It was load-bearing. It was the thing that had held her upright through 5 years of very cold winters, and to undermine it carelessly would be to undermine her, and he had no interest in doing that. Eli recovered fully by the second week of December. Florence had said accurately that he was a boy who had his father's patience, and that patience extended to recovery. He ate what he was given, rested when he was told, and returned to himself with quiet determination. He was a thin, dark-haired boy of 14 with serious eyes and a manner that was older than his years, and when he met Noah for the first time he shook his hand with a firm grip and said, "I've heard about you from my mother." Noah said, "What has she said?" Eli considered this. "He said that you bring things and don't make a fuss about it, and she thinks that is a point in your favor." Noah found this extremely encouraging. Samuel, who was 11, was a different creature, entirely rounder in the face, quicker to laugh, and possessed of an absolutely uninhibited curiosity about Noah's life, which he interrogated with the thoroughness of a small journalist. He wanted to know where Noah had been and what he had done, and whether he had ever been shot, and whether he had ever seen an outlaw. And Noah answered him with the particular patience one extends to genuinely interested children, which is to say, he told him the honest versions of the stories, which were less dramatic but more accurate than what the boy was hoping for. He had in fact been shot once in the left shoulder, during a stint as a deputy in a Texas border town in 1872. It had been neither heroic nor particularly interesting. A drunk man had fired at a wall, and Noah had been standing at an unfortunate angle relative to the wall. He had told Samuel this, and the boy had looked slightly deflated before deciding that a shoulder wound was still a shoulder wound, and readjusting his estimation of Noah accordingly. Florence was present for most of these early conversations, usually occupied with some task in the kitchen or near the hearth but clearly listening, and Noah found himself increasingly aware of the pleasure of her presence. The way she laughed at something Samuel said, a quick bright sound she seemed to release without intending to, and then would school her face back to its composed expression, as though the laugh had escaped without permission. The way she moved through the small space of the cabin, with an economy and certainty of purpose that spoke of long practice and deep familiarity. The way she asked him questions that were few but precise, always hitting the center of a thing rather than the perimeter. In the middle of December, he stayed for supper for the first time. She had made a venison stew with root vegetables from the cellar, and she set a place for him with the direct manner of a woman who does not make fussy productions out of hospitality. And he sat at the table with Eli on his right, and Samuel on his left and Florence across from him, and the four of them ate in a fire-lit room with the wind pressing at the walls, and it was one of the finest evenings Noah could remember in several years. He helped with the dishes afterward, which she accepted with mild surprise and no argument, and then he sat at the table while she mended a shirt of Eli's, and the boys occupied themselves at the other end of the room, Eli reading, Samuel drawing something in the dirt of the hearthstone with a stick, and they talked. Not about anything urgent. About the town and the people in it, about what she grew in the kitchen garden and what she intended to expand in the spring, about the horse operation at the Mercer place and what Walt Mercer was planning to do with it. Easy conversation, the kind that builds slowly and steadily, like a structure that knows it will need to support weight. He noticed that she never spoke of Thomas by name without first pausing, as if she were opening a door she usually kept shut. She said, Thomas always said the north wall was the weak point of the cabin, and Noah understood that this was not casual mention but a deliberate act, the kind of controlled grief that has been organized over years into something that can be managed. He said, he was right about the north wall. I noticed the chinking when I drove up the first time. You've done a good job keeping it up. She said, it takes every autumn, but yes. And then she seemed to consider that she had said something personal, and she turned her attention back to the mending. He rode back to the Mercer place in the dark that night and told the horse, in the way that men who live close to the land sometimes address animals, that he was in considerable trouble. The horse offered no opinion. Christmas came and went in Harrow Creek with the modest celebrations available to a small Kansas town in 1878. The pastor gave a longer sermon than usual. Mrs. Potts made a fruitcake that was a genuine effort if not an unqualified success, and Walt Mercer provided a holiday bonus to his hands in the form of a bottle of whiskey each. Noah sent a small package to the Callahan cabin by way of the boy who ran errands in town, a set of drawing pencils for Samuel, a good quality skinning knife for Eli, and for Florence, a small book on kitchen gardening that he'd found at the Harrow Creek General Store. He agonized briefly over the book. It might seem condescending, as though he thought she needed instruction. But she had mentioned once that she wanted to expand her garden and had been looking for information on crop rotation, and it was genuinely useful, and he decided that genuinely useful was the correct standard. She sent back a note with the errand boy that said, "Thank you." The boys were very pleased. "The book is exactly what I needed. I am making Christmas dinner on the 25th if you have no other obligation." He had no other obligation. He arrived at noon with a good bottle of wine he'd bought at considerable expense from a merchant in town who imported them for a small and specific clientele, and a smoked ham he'd cured himself in the Mercer smokehouse, which Walt had generously permitted. Florence opened the door and looked at the ham with an expression that moved through surprise and something harder to read before arriving at gratitude. She said, "That is very generous." He said, "It came out well. I smoked it with apple wood." He offered this as practical information, not sentiment, and she accepted it in the same spirit. The dinner was remarkable. Florence cooked the ham with dried apples and molasses and made biscuits and put up the last of her preserved green beans and opened a jar of plum preserves she'd been saving. And the four of them sat at the table in the small warm cabin and ate until they were full and comfortable. And the candlelight moved softly over everything, and Samuel told a story about a rabbit he'd seen that he was firmly convinced was the same rabbit he'd seen in the same spot 3 different times, which he believed was evidence of either remarkable rabbit intelligence or supernatural activity. And Eli said it was probably just a rabbit, and Samuel said that was exactly what a rabbit would want you to think, and Florence laughed, that surprised bright laugh, and looked across the table at Noah, and their eyes held for a moment, and something passed between them that was not yet named but was very clearly present. After dinner, when the boys had gone to the loft and Florence and Noah were sitting at either end of the table with a small glass of wine each, she said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why do you come here?" He looked at her. He said, "I think you know why." She looked down at the wine glass and then back up at him, and she said, "I am 36 years old and I have 2 boys and a homestead, and I have been managing alone for 5 years. I am not in the habit of making room for things that might not last." He said, "That is very fair." She said, "I am not discouraging you. I am telling you the terms." He said, "I understand the terms." She said, "I am not sure you do, because the terms include the possibility that I might never get comfortable enough with this to move forward with it, and you should know that before you spend any more of your time driving up this creek road." He said, "Florence." He said it quietly, and the sound of her name in his mouth seemed to catch her slightly off guard, and she looked at him with something unguarded in her face. He said, "I drove back to the Mercer place after our first conversation, and I told my horse I was in considerable trouble, and I have not been sorry about that for a single day since." He said, "I am not asking anything of you. I am asking only that you let me keep coming back." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The pine needle steam did help Eli's chest, by the way." He said, "I thought it might." She said, "You can keep coming back." January was the hard center of the Kansas winter, the weeks when the cold settled in with the serious and permanent intention of staying, and the landscape went the blue-white of old bone under a pale sky. Noah continued his visits to the Callahan place, and by mid-January he was helping with the more physical work without either of them commenting on it. He would split wood or repair a fence post or haul water from the creek hole, and she would have coffee on when he came inside, and they would talk at the table while the cold pressed at the windows. He learned her history by installment. She had come from Ohio originally, the daughter of a farm family in the eastern part of the state. She had married Thomas at 24, and they had come west because Thomas believed in the promise of the frontier land grants, which was not an unreasonable belief in 1866. She had built a life here from the ground up, alongside Thomas and then without him, and she spoke of this without self-pity but also without false cheerfulness. She said once, "I miss him less for himself now than for what having him meant, the partnership of it, having someone else in the wagon with you." Noah said he understood that. He said that was perhaps the loneliest thing about living alone, not the absence of a particular person, but the absence of the structure that a particular person provides. She had looked at him when he said that, really looked at him and said, "Yes, that is exactly it." He told her about himself in the same measured way. His family had been in Tennessee. His father had been a veterinarian and a practical man who had given Noah both a love of animals and a useful mechanical patience with broken things. He had served briefly at the tail end of the war as a very young man. He had been 18 in 1863 and had seen enough in 6 months to last him considerably longer, and afterward had drifted west with the intention of finding something to do that was not looking at the ruined geography of the Old South. He had worked cattle in Texas, done some construction work during the railway expansion years, served as a deputy in 2 different towns, and eventually found himself with the strong feeling that the frontier was closing around its own edges, and that a man needed to find his footing before the ground changed shape entirely. She said, "Is that why you stopped at Harrow Creek?" He said, "It is part of why." He said, "I also heard it was good country if you had a mind to stay somewhere." She said, "Did you have a mind to stay?" He said, "I am developing one." She turned to the window and looked at the white winter outside, and he could see the color in her face was slightly different than it had been a moment ago. And she said, more quietly, "It is good country if you can get through the winters." He said, "I have been reliably informed that it can be done." She turned back and looked at him, and this time the almost smile was a real one, brief and warm and genuine. And she said, "Who told you that?" He said, "A woman I know." February brought a thaw, and then a hard freeze that cracked 2 of the fence posts along the creek side of the Callahan property. And Noah came out on a Saturday with post lumber he'd cut from the timber that the Mercer place kept for maintenance. And Eli worked alongside him with the natural, easy competence of a boy who has been doing physical work since he was young. They worked well together, Noah and Eli, with the companionable near silence of people who are doing a job and taking it seriously. And at one point Eli looked at Noah and said, without any particular preamble, "Are you going to court my mother properly?" Noah said, "I have every intention of it." Eli said, "She won't make it easy." Noah said, "I know." Eli considered this and then said, "She laughs more when you're here." He said it neutrally as though reporting an observable fact, and then he went back to tamping the post, and Noah did the same, and they finished the fence in the afternoon. Florence brought out coffee and cornbread mid-morning, and she stood in the snow watching them work, and there was something in her face that Noah had not seen before, a softness, a kind of relief that had been worn down over years and was only now, cautiously, beginning to return. He looked at her over the fence post, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, and it was a great deal more articulate than words would have been. It was in the 3rd week of February that the thing happened that changed the shape of everything. Noah arrived at the Callahan place on a Thursday morning to find Florence not in the yard and not at the cabin, and Eli standing at the gate with an expression of controlled anxiety. Noah said, "What's happened?" Eli said, "She went to town yesterday and she isn't back." He said it quietly so Samuel, who was behind him, would not hear the worry in it. He said, "The mule came back this morning without her. Hector came back alone." Noah was back on his horse before Eli finished the sentence. He found Florence on the creek road 2 miles from town, sitting in the ditch with Hector's lead rope in her hand and a cut on her forehead that had dried to a dark line above her right eye. The mule had shied at something. She said it was probably a coyote, and she had been thrown, and she had twisted her ankle on the fall and been unable to walk back, and she had sat in the ditch in the February cold for the better part of 12 hours, and she had not at any point called for help. She had been there 12 hours, alone in a ditch on a cold February night. And she had not called out, not waved down a passing rider, not sent Hector back deliberately to bring someone. She had simply sat there in the cold and assumed she would figure it out. Noah got down from his horse and crouched in front of her and looked at the cut on her forehead and the angle of her ankle, and he said, "How long have you been out here?" She said, "Since yesterday evening." He said, "Florence." She said, "I was about to try walking again." He said, "Your ankle is swollen." He said it carefully. He looked at her face, which was pale and tired and still absolutely composed, and the composure in that particular circumstance, sitting in a ditch in the freezing dark after 12 hours alone and not making a sound, undid something in him that had been very carefully held in place. He said, "I need to say something and I need you to hear it properly." She looked at him. He said, "What you have done here," he gestured, "not only at the ditch but at the whole sweep of the property and the town and the years. What you have done in the past 5 years, feeding those boys and keeping that place and not asking anything of anyone, is the finest thing I have witnessed in 33 years of living." He said, "I want to be absolutely clear that I am saying that not as a compliment but as a statement of fact. You are the most capable and most principled and most extraordinary person I have met in my entire life." She looked at him and something crossed her face, something that started in the eyes and moved downward and was not quite grief and was not quite relief, but was something between them, the particular emotion of a person who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has been told that someone else can see the weight of it. She pressed her lips together and the composure held for a moment, and then it did not, and she wept. Not loudly, not in the broken way of despair, but in the slow, quiet way of someone releasing something that has been held too long, and she put her hand over her face and her shoulders moved, and Noah stayed crouched in front of her, and he did not tell her to stop, and he did not look away, and he did not pretend it was not happening. After a moment she lowered her hand and looked at him with eyes that were red and tired and more open than he had ever seen them, and she said, "I don't know why I'm crying." He said, "I think you do." She said, "I am very tired." He said, "I know. Let me take you home." She let him lift her onto his horse, and she did not argue, and she did not qualify it as a practical necessity rather than something she wanted, which Noah understood to be significant. He led Hector behind them, and they went back up the creek road in the February morning, with the pale sky above the cottonwoods and Florence's hand resting against his arm, where she had taken hold of him to steady herself, and she did not release it until they came through the gate. Eli and Samuel were both waiting. Samuel ran to his mother, and she held him with her head down against his hair, and Eli stood back and met Noah's eyes, and they exchanged the complicated, wordless understanding of people who have been frightened about the same person. Noah helped Florence inside and put her on the chair by the fire, and elevated the ankle with a folded blanket and cleaned the cut on her forehead with water and a clean cloth, and she allowed all of this without resistance, which told him that she was genuinely shaken even if she would never say so directly. He stayed 3 days. He slept on the floor by the fire wrapped in his bedroll, and in the mornings he made coffee and dealt with the outdoor work, and in the evenings he sat at the table with Florence, who could hobble cautiously by the second day, and they talked and were quiet in turns, and the boys went to bed, and the fire went low, and neither of them wanted to end the evenings, but did so with the particular restraint of people who are being careful with something fragile. On the second evening Florence said, "I think I owe you an apology." He said, "For what?" She said, "For being so difficult about accepting help." He said, "You don't owe me an apology for that. Not ever." He said, "What you described about why you couldn't accept it, I understand it. And I'm not asking you to change it." He said, "I'm only asking to be in the position of someone you allow to help occasionally, because I want to be in that position and I believe I have demonstrated that I will not make it humiliating." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You have demonstrated that quite thoroughly." He said, "Good. Then we understand each other." She said, "Noah." She said his name and paused and he waited. She said, "I am not going to be a simple person to love." He said, "I am not looking for simple." He said it straight across the table at her and she looked back at him with those steady dark eyes and the firelight in them, and the evening was very still. She said, "All right." He said, "All right," she said, "come calling properly. On Sunday. Bring those boys something ridiculous that Samuel will be overly excited about." He said, "I was thinking about a set of tin soldiers I saw at the general store." She said, "That is exactly right." He rode back to the Mercer place on the morning of the third day, and told Walt Mercer that he had a question of a personal nature, which was whether Walt would consider selling him the use of the 40 acres on the eastern edge of the Mercer property that Walt had been letting go fallow, with a possible path toward ownership. Walt looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at the window in the direction of the creek road, and then looked back at Noah and said, "Well, I'll be." And then he said yes, they could work something out. Noah came calling on Sunday with the tin soldiers, which produced from Samuel a reaction that suggested he had received news of significant national importance rather than a bag of small painted metal figures, and with a bottle of good apple cider from the general store. And he and Florence sat on the step of the cabin in the weak late February sun, while the boys occupied the yard with the soldiers and a complex military operation that involved several fence posts and appeared to be going very badly for one side. He said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "You can tell me things. You don't need to announce them first." He said, "I am building towards something here in Harrow Creek and in this county." He said, "I have spoken with Walt about the eastern acreage, and there is a possibility of a proper claim there." He said, "I am not telling you this to put pressure on anything. I am telling you because I believe in being honest about my intentions, and I want you to know that mine are serious." She was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the boys and the fence posts and the soldiers. She said, "Thomas used to say that a man's intentions were only as good as his actions, and that you could learn everything about a man's intentions by watching his actions for long enough." He said, "What have my actions told you?" She looked at him. She said, "They have told me that you are a serious man, and that you are kind without being soft, and that you respect people's dignity, and that you are very good at not making a fuss about things." She said, "They have told me quite a lot." He said, "I hope that's favorable." She said, "It is considerably favorable." He took her hand then, which he had not done before, and she looked down at their hands together and then back up at him, and she did not take hers away. Her hand was work-roughened and strong and warm, and they sat like that in the thin February sun, while the boys waged their tin war in the yard. And it was one of the simplest things Noah had ever done, and one of the most significant. March arrived with the tentative warmth of early spring and the creek running high with snowmelt, and things between Florence and Noah continued to develop with the particular steady momentum of something that has been built carefully and does not need to rush. He came calling twice a week and spent Sundays at the Callahan place regularly, and the meals became something all four of them organized around. Samuel assigned himself the role of bread watcher with great seriousness, and Eli began to demonstrate a quiet interest in Noah's carpentry knowledge that led to Noah teaching him how to joint lumber properly, which became a regular Saturday occupation. Florence began to let herself have opinions about Noah that she had not permitted herself before. She noticed that he was funny in a very dry, quiet way that required attention. He would say something that seemed entirely neutral, and then look at her with the corner of his mouth just slightly up, and she would realize that it had been deeply amusing, and the delayed laughter that followed was its own particular pleasure. She noticed that he was completely unself-conscious with the boys, treating them with the same level of serious respect he gave adults, which they responded to with the instinctive understanding that children have of when they are being genuinely valued. She noticed that when he was uncertain about something he became very still, which she found unexpectedly comforting, because it meant that when he spoke with certainty, she could trust it. She began to let herself think about things she had not allowed herself to think about in 5 years. What it would be like to not be the only adult in the cabin. What it would mean for the boys to have a man's presence in their daily lives, not as a replacement for their father. She was too clear-eyed for that romanticism, but as its own thing, its own particular value. What it would be like to have someone to sit with in the evenings and talk to about ordinary things, the kind of talking that is not important but is, in its accumulation, absolutely essential. In late March, he asked her to walk with him along the creek. The evening was mild, the first genuinely warm evening of the season, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to show the pale green blur of new leaves, and the creek was high and singing over its stones. They walked along the bank with the long light of the spring evening coming through the trees, and Noah stopped at a bend in the creek where there was a flat sandstone shelf, and the water ran clear and quick, and he turned to her. He said, "Florence, I would like to ask you something." She said, "I have been fairly certain you were going to ask me something for several weeks." He said, "Have you been dreading it?" She said, "No. I have been thinking about my answer." He said, "What have you decided?" She said, "I think you should ask first and then I will tell you my decision." He looked at her for a moment, and in the spring light by the creek with the trees coming into leaf, he said, "Florence Callahan, I would like very much to marry you if you will have me. I want to build something here. I want to build it with you and with those boys. I am not asking you to need me. I am asking you to let me be here." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I will not pretend it is easy for me to say yes to this. Not because of you. You are the best man I have known since Thomas, and in certain ways you are better suited to me because you understand what I have built and you do not want to take it over." She said, "But it is still a large thing." He said, "I know it is." She said, "But yes, yes, I will marry you, Noah Bailey." He took both her hands and held them, and she looked up at him, and the evening was very still, and the creek moved over its stones, and he bent his head and kissed her the first time, careful and warm and entirely serious. And she kissed him back with a decisiveness that was entirely characteristic of her. She said, quietly, when they separated, "I am glad you drove up the creek road that first morning." He said, "So am I." They were married in June of 1879 in the small Harrow Creek Church on a Saturday morning that cooperated with excellent weather, which everyone in the county took as an endorsement. Clara Mercer cried, which she had predicted she would do. Walt Mercer shook Noah's hand approximately 4 times during the reception at the church hall. Samuel wore a white shirt that he had been promised he could immediately change out of after the ceremony, which he did with remarkable speed. Eli stood beside Noah as what might loosely be called a best man, which he performed with his characteristic dignified gravity. And at one point during the reception, Florence looked across the room and saw Eli saying something to Noah with his serious 14-year-old face, and Noah listening and then laughing, and the sight of it tightened her chest in the most pleasurable way. The spring and summer that led to the wedding had seen Noah and Eli and Florence working the Callahan land with a new intensity, putting in a larger crop than Florence had ever attempted alone. More corn, more beans, a small wheat field on the southeast quarter that Noah had helped break and plant with the combined draft of Hector and a borrowed horse. The combination of Florence's 5 years of accumulated knowledge of the land and Noah's physical capability and practical agricultural sense produced a crop that summer that was the best the Callahan property had ever seen. And the harvest in August was a thing of genuine abundance that made Florence stand at the edge of the corn field one evening in the long August light and feel, for the first time in 5 years, something that was not simply relief but actual, uncomplicated joy. She told Noah this that evening. They were sitting on the step of the cabin. They had begun sleeping in the main room, and Noah had extended the loft for the boys. And the evening was warm and full of crickets and the smell of cut corn and dried earth, and she said, "I haven't felt this in a long time." He said, "What?" She said, "Like it's enough. Like what's here is enough." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the evening settled around them, and the boys were inside, and the harvest was in the barn, and the creek was running, and the Kansas summer was warm as a held breath. He said, "It's more than enough." By autumn, Florence knew she was expecting. She told Noah on an October morning in the kitchen, with the same directness she brought to everything, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and his face did a remarkable thing, moving through surprise and certainty and a deep unmistakable gladness in about 3 seconds, and then he came around the table and put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead, and she laughed at the formality of it, and he laughed too, and she said, "Are you pleased?" He said, "Florence." He said, "I am so far beyond pleased there is not a word for it." She said, "Good. Because there is a great deal of work to be done on the loft if the boys are going to have more room." He said, "I will start this week." She said, "I know you will." The baby came in late June of 1880, a boy they named Henry Thomas Bailey Thomas for Florence's late husband, which Noah had insisted upon, saying it was right and important and he would not hear any argument about it. And Florence had looked at him when he said it with the particular expression she wore when he did something that she had not entirely expected, and that moved her considerably. Henry arrived in the manner of babies who have decided on a schedule and intend to keep it, promptly at dawn on a warm Tuesday, and the midwife, Mrs. Hartigan from town, declared him a fine specimen, and Eli came down from the loft to look at him with the solemnity of a young man confronting the full scope of change. And Samuel looked at him with enormous eyes and said, "He is very red," and Florence said, "You were very red too," and Samuel said he did not believe that, and she said she could find witnesses. Henry was a good-natured baby who slept reliably and ate enthusiastically, and took to the world with an openness that made people like him immediately. By autumn, he was the undisputed center of the Callahan-Bailey household's collective attention, even from Eli, who had initially been somewhat cool on the concept of a baby brother, but who was observed on multiple occasions sitting in the rocking chair with Henry on his knee, telling him in a low voice about the mechanics of fence building and crop rotation, which Henry received with focused and presumably educational attention. The homestead expanded in these years with the methodical certainty of people who know what they are doing and have the time and the will to do it. Noah built an addition onto the east side of the cabin that gave them 2 proper bedrooms, and he built a new barn with better insulation than the old one, and he brought in 2 more draft horses and expanded the cattle operation to a modest herd. Florence's kitchen garden became a proper market garden, and by 1881 she was selling produce not only in Harrow Creek, but to a restaurant in the larger town of Ellsworth 20 miles east, which had developed a reliable appetite for her preserved goods and fresh vegetables. Eli turned 16 in the spring of 1881, and was by that point essentially a full farming partner, tall as Noah and possessed of an increasingly confident knowledge of the land and the animals. He had begun to say things like we should rotate the south field this year that made Florence feel the particular pride of a mother who can see the adult her child is becoming. Samuel, who was 13, was still irrepressibly himself curious and voluble and prone to ambitious projects, including an attempt to build a water wheel on the creek that was genuinely well-engineered for a 13-year-old and partially functional before the spring flood reorganized it. Noah watched this family he had married into and helped build with a constant quiet gratitude that he expressed not in large statements, but in the accumulated evidence of his presence. The fence that was always mended, the lamp that was always filled, the hand on the small of Florence's back when she was tired, the stories he told the boys at night when Florence was nursing Henry, the way he said her name Florence with a particular weight that she had come to recognize as a private language between them. There were hard times in those years too. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was bitter, and a late frost in April of 1881 took half the wheat crop. And there was a difficult month in 1882 when the cattle prices fell, and the arithmetic of the homestead was very uncomfortable. But these hard times now had the essential difference of being shared two people in the wagon instead of one. And Florence understood with crystalline clarity the difference that made. Not that the problems disappeared or that the solutions were easier, but that the weight of them was distributed, and a distributed weight does not break the carrier the way a solitary one does. She said this to Noah one evening in the winter of 1882, sitting by the fire after the children were in bed, and he listened and then said, "I thought about you often those first weeks after I arrived in Harrow Creek." He said, "Walt told me about you and I kept thinking about what it would take doing all of that alone." He said, "I could not have done it." She said, "Yes, you could have. You are that kind of person." He said, "No, I might have survived it, but I would not have done it the way you did it." He said, "I would have bent somewhere. You didn't bend." She said, "I almost bent that night in the ditch." He said, "That wasn't bending. That was just being human." She said, "I cried in front of you." He said, "Yes, and it was the bravest thing I'd seen anyone do in a very long time." She looked at him across the fire and said, "Why?" He said, "Because you had been holding everything together by sheer force of will for 5 years, and when I said what I said, instead of deflecting it or arguing with it or redirecting the conversation, you let yourself feel it." He said, "That takes more courage than the splitting wood and the venison hunting and all the rest of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have made me a more courageous person." He said, "I think you were always this person." She said, "I mean the other kind of courage, the kind for this." She indicated the fire and the room and by implication, him and the children upstairs and the life they had built. She said, "I didn't think I was capable of this again. After Thomas, I thought that part of me had closed." He said, and she said, "And you drove up the creek road with feed corn and an implausible story about having too much of it, and here we are." He laughed and she laughed with him, and the fire crackled and outside the Kansas winter was cold and vast and the cabin was warm. Henry Bailey learned to walk in the spring of 1882, which he achieved with the particular reckless confidence of a second child who has older brothers to follow and does not fully grasp the concept of caution. He also began to talk with a speed and directness that reminded Florence very much of someone, and when she told Noah this, he looked at Henry and then looked at Florence and said, "He has your eyes and your stubbornness and your complete indifference to the opinions of others." And Florence said that was a great deal to attribute to a 22-month-old, and Noah said he called it as he saw it. The autumn of 1882 brought news from the East that was both distant and not entirely distant, the continuing consolidation of the frontier, the sense that the wide-open era of the Kansas plains was changing shape. The railway had reached further, the land claims were being parceled and settled with increasing density, the old wild country was becoming something more organized. Some people mourned this, particularly the men who had come west specifically for the openness. Noah did not mourn it. He had come west not for the wildness but for the possibility, and possibility was not diminished by settlement. It was different, but it was still there, in the land and the people and the work. He said this to Florence one evening and she said, "You sound like a man making peace with something." He said, "I made peace with it a while ago, around the time I drove up your creek road." She said, "You think about that quite often." He said, "I think about that morning as one of the best decisions I've ever made." She said, "You were essentially uninvited." He said, "That's what makes it one of the best decisions. Easy decisions don't count the same way." She thought about this and then said, "That's true." By 1883, Eli was 18 and had become a young man of impressive capability and quiet authority. He had the Callahan look dark and spare and direct, but there was something in his manner that Florence suspected he had absorbed from Noah, a particular patient deliberateness in approaching problems. He had begun courting, with appropriate and somewhat agonized seriousness, the eldest daughter of the Svensson family, the children of old Marta who had once offered Florence a meal and been gently refused. The girl's name was Anna, and she was 17 and intelligent and slightly shy, and Eli's courtship of her was so careful and so genuine that Florence found it both endearing and slightly familiar. She said to Noah one spring evening, "He reminds me of someone." Noah said, "I know." She said, "Is that strange, that I see you in him?" He said, "No." He said, "I think he learned some things from watching." He said, "I hope the good ones at least." She said, "Predominantly the good ones." In the summer of 1883, Florence discovered she was expecting again, and she told Noah in the same direct October morning way as she told him the first time, and his face did the same remarkable sequence: surprise, certainty, gladness, and she laughed, because some things did not change and she was very glad of it. This baby came in February of 1884, another boy, whom they named James, which was Noah's father's name. James arrived in the manner of the impatient, which was different from Henry's punctual orderliness, and he spent his first year making his preferences forcefully known in a way that suggested he would be an interesting child to parent. Henry, aged nearly 4, regarded him with the philosophical resignation of an eldest who has been displaced, before deciding that James was acceptable and appointing himself James's primary educator in all matters of farm life, which produced some interesting educational moments when James began pulling himself upright, and Henry began explaining, in a very serious 3-year-old voice, the function of various farm implements. Samuel, who was 15 and still irrepressible, had developed in these years an unexpected facility for mathematics and an equally unexpected interest in law. He had gotten hold of a copy of Blackstone's commentaries from the pastor, who had a small library, and had read it with the kind of focus he generally reserved for engineering projects. Florence had watched this with the particular attention of a mother who is observing the shape of her child's future forming, and she had spoken to Noah about it. And Noah had said, very seriously, that if Samuel had a mind for the law, then the law was what he should pursue, and they should find a way to support that. They had worked out, over the years, a financial position that was not comfortable in the wealthy sense but was solid. The produce operation, the cattle, and Noah's carpentry work. He had taken to doing custom cabinetry for the growing number of families in the county who could afford it, combined to give them a reliable income and a growing reserve. The $16 in the tin under the floorboard had been superseded many times over, and Florence kept the tin anyway, not as savings but as a reminder. She had once shown it to Noah in the second year of their marriage, and he had held it in his hand, and understood without being told what it represented, and he had handed it back to her with a careful respect that she had felt in her chest. The summers and winters and harvests rolled through the middle of the 1880s with the rhythm of a life that was genuinely good, not simple, not without difficulty, but good in the foundational way of things built properly on solid ground. Florence turned 40 in 1882, and Noah turned 38, and these were not events they made a great fuss over. But Florence woke on her birthday to find that Noah had been up at dawn and made breakfast and put a small bunch of late-season wildflowers on the table in a tin cup, and the boys, Henry included, wobbling importantly with the instruction to put the flowers on the table, had arranged themselves in the kitchen with the morning light coming in. And she had stood in the doorway looking at all of them and felt something so full it was almost difficult to contain. Noah had looked at her from across the room and said, "Happy birthday, Florence." She had said very quietly, "Thank you for all of this." He had said, "Thank you for letting me be here for it." In the spring of 1885, Eli married Anna Svensson in the same Harrow Creek church where Noah and Florence had been married 6 years before, and the ceremony had the looping warm quality of a community event that is also a private triumph. Old Marta Svensson, now quite elderly but still present, had taken Florence's hand during the reception and said, "You were always a remarkable woman." And Florence had looked at her and said, "You were very kind to me in the hard years." And Marta had waved this off and said, "I only offered. You were the one who kept going." Noah had seen this exchange from across the room and asked Florence about it later that evening, and she had told him what Marta had said, and Noah had nodded and said, "She's right." And Florence had said, "You are biased." And he had said, "I am biased and I am correct, and those things are not mutually exclusive." They stood together in the doorway of the church hall in the spring evening, watching the party continue, Samuel doing something energetic in the corner with a group of his friends, Henry age 5, and very pleased with his formal shirt sitting on Noah's mother's lap, she having come out from Tennessee for the occasion, James age 1.5 being carried around by Eli with the specific attentiveness of a new husband who wishes to demonstrate that he is good with children. Florence leaned slightly against Noah's shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the evening was warm and full of voices, and the creek road was pale in the spring dusk beyond the window. She said, "Do you remember telling me I was the finest thing you had ever witnessed?" He said, "I remember saying it was the finest thing I had ever witnessed. I said what you had done, what you'd built." She said, "You said it in a ditch in February." He said, "Good lighting, though." She laughed that bright, surprised laugh that he had been collecting for 6 years. She said, "I wept in front of you." He said, "Yes." She said, "I had not wept in front of anyone in 5 years, not since Thomas died." He said, "I know." She said, "I have been thinking about that, about what it meant that it happened then." He paused and she felt him look at her and she looked up at him. She said, "I think it was the first time I let someone see me properly. And you didn't look away." He said, "I was not going to look away." She said, "I know that now. I didn't know it then." He said, "What did you know then?" She said, "That you were telling the truth, that it wasn't flattery, and that something was going to change." He said, "Were you frightened?" She said, "Yes." She said, "And I was also, for the first time in 5 years, not entirely alone with it. That was more important." He held her a little tighter and she let him, and the spring evening moved around the old church hall, and the voices of their family and their friends and their children filled it, and the Kansas sky outside was going from blue to rose to the deep quiet violet of true evening. The years that followed were the years of consolidation and growth, the years that Florence had worked toward through 5 hard winters without entirely knowing whether they would ever arrive. The homestead grew to 300 acres when Noah purchased the eastern acreage from Walt Mercer formally in 1886, the transaction completed with a handshake, and a document signed in the Harrow Creek courthouse that Noah brought home and set on the kitchen table for Florence to see. She had read it with the same focused attention she brought to all important documents and then looked up and said, "This is our land." He said, "It's our land." Eli and Anna built their own home on the creek road a half-mile from the original Callahan cabin, and by 1887 they had a daughter of their own, a dark-haired girl named Clara, for Clara Mercer, who had become something of an unofficial grandmother to the Bailey family. Florence held this baby at her christening with the particular emotion of a woman who has survived enough hard winters to fully appreciate the meaning of a child born into security. And she looked at Eli standing with his wife and his daughter with an expression that Eli, watching her, would later describe to Anna as the most purely happy face he had ever seen his mother wear. Samuel had gone east to read law in 1886, funded by the combined enterprise of the homestead and his own considerable determination, and he wrote letters home that were meticulous and funny, and full of observations about the Eastern world that made Florence and Noah laugh at the kitchen table while Henry, age 6, demanded to know what was in the letter and whether it mentioned him. He was admitted to practice in 1889 and wrote with the news in a letter that had somewhat less of his characteristic composure than usual, and Florence read it aloud to the family at dinner and had to pause twice to collect herself, which was noted by Henry, age 9, who said, "Mama, are you crying?" And Noah said, "She is allowed to cry whenever she wants to," and Henry considered this and said, "Yes, because she is very brave," which produced another pause. Henry himself was developing into a boy who combined Florence's directness with Noah's calm, which made him at 9 an unusually straightforward and thoughtful person. He had Florence's dark eyes and Noah's height, and the particular steady confidence that comes from growing up in a house where both your parents are genuinely present and genuinely committed. He was also very attached to James, age 5, whom he had been educating since James could walk, and James reciprocated this attachment with complete and uncritical admiration, which Henry wore with the grace of someone who takes the responsibility of being admired seriously. James was, as advertised, an interesting child to parent. He had opinions about everything and expressed them without apparent concern for social consequences, and he laughed extremely easily and cried almost never and approached the world with a forward-leaning curiosity that sometimes got him into trouble with the chickens and occasionally the fence, but which was fundamentally a very good quality to possess. In the late autumn of 1889, Florence and Noah sat together on the step of the cabin on a Sunday evening when the harvest was in, and the children were settled, and the air had the particular quality of October in Kansas, cold and clear, and carrying the smell of cut corn and turned earth. 15 years since Thomas had died, 10 years since Noah had driven up the creek road. The cottonwoods had gone gold and the creek was low and singing in its October way, and the sky above the prairie was the color of faded ink. Florence said, "I've been thinking about the winters." He said, "The 5 winters." She said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about who I was then, not with sadness. Just looking at it from here." He said, "What do you see?" She said, "Someone who had decided that survival was the only option and had organized everything around it." She said it was the right decision. It was what the situation demanded, but it was a very narrow way to live. He said, "You kept them fed and you kept the land and you kept yourself. That is not narrow." She said, "No. But there was so much I was not allowing myself." She looked at the creek and the cottonwoods. She said, "I was so afraid that if I allowed anything in, any help, any softness, any other person, it would all collapse, as though the whole thing were balanced on a single point and any disturbance would bring it down." He said, and she said, "And it held, even when I let you in, even when I stopped holding everything so tightly." She said it held because it was solid, because I had built it solidly. He said, "Yes." She said, "You said it was the finest thing you had ever witnessed." He said, "I said that and I meant it and I have not changed my mind." She looked at him. She said, "You know what the finest thing I have ever witnessed is?" He shook his head. She said, "Every time you look at Henry and James the way you look at them, like they are yours completely, like there is no qualification in it." He said, "There isn't." She said, "I know. That's what makes it remarkable." He reached over and took her hand in the October evening, the way he had taken it at the creek bend in March 10 years before, and she held his hand with the same strong, certain grip, and the Kansas prairie spread out before them in the last light of the afternoon, golden and wide and generous, full of the kind of silence that is not empty but accumulated. Inside the cabin, Henry was reading to James from the torn-cover Dickens novel, the same one Florence had read to Eli all those years ago, and his voice carried clearly through the open window in the measured way of someone who loves the story he is telling. Noah and Florence sat on the step and listened, and the evening came on around them. Florence said, "I am glad I was in that ditch." He turned and looked at her. She said, "I mean it. If Hector had not shied, if I had not fallen, you might never have said what you said, and I might have kept telling myself that you were simply a helpful neighbor for considerably longer." He said, "I would have found another way to say it." She said, "Would you?" He said, "Florence." He said her name in the particular way, with that particular weight. He said, "I drove up your creek road on a Thursday morning in December with feed corn. I had specifically purchased for the purpose of driving up your creek road, and I had been thinking about how to tell you what I thought about you for approximately 3 weeks. He said, I would have found a way. She laughed the bright, surprised laugh, at 57 degrees on an October evening, the same laugh that had first made him understand the shape of the trouble he was in, and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder and said, Yes, I suppose you would have. The sun went down behind the flat Kansas horizon, and the first stars appeared above the prairie, and the creek talked its October talk, and the cottonwoods shed their gold into the darkening air. And inside the cabin Henry read Dickens to James, and outside Noah held Florence's hand, and the land was theirs, and the life was theirs, and the winters were past. They stayed on the step until the dark was full, and the stars were out in their Kansas abundance. And then Florence stood, and Noah stood, and she put her arm through his, and they went inside together into the warmth and the lamplight and the voices of their children. And she pulled the door closed on the cold October night with the easy certainty of a woman who has no more to prove to the dark. And the dark, for its part, let her go.